It began, as these things often do, with something too small to notice, until it's already inside your life. I was sorting through a series of field reports in the cold room of Archive Bay 3-1, of those places where half the lights hum with a pitch that eats into your jawbone, and the other half just flicker as a reminder that the funding dried up years ago. I had no assignment that week. My last retrieval was a failed geothermal scan of a sinkhole in northern Canada. The kind of mission that comes with 50 pages of pre-check protocol and ends with a shrug and a silent drive back to the airfield. I wasn't expecting anything, and that's why I noticed it. Someone had slid a manila envelope under the bulkhead door of my storage unit. No markings, no label. The paper was new, not from the archive. Inside one item, a black thumb drive with a red label strip across its back. The words smudged into eligibility, except for one, clearance. No department stamp, no SNOF, no chain of custody. That alone should have meant immediate disposal. Protocol dictated it. But I broke protocol. The lock on the drive was military grade, buried behind layers of obsolete encryption that hadn't been standard issue in over a decade. That should have been my second warning. The key embedded inside wasn't a file. It was a real-time access credential and alphanumeric override paired with geo-coordinates embedded in metadata. When I plugged it into my offline terminal, the screen didn't ask permission. It just went black, then green, then began typing on its own, as if someone, somewhere, had been waiting for me specifically. Access code 009RedCivSig, validated. Location confirmed. Lock, override enabled. Door status, standby. The coordinates pointed to a narrow elevation drop along a forgotten sector of the Cordelia region, west of the Chilean border but on no recent map. When I cross-checked with satellite topography, it was just blank terrain. No elevation data, no civilian overlay. Just a flat gray segment of non-priority zone. But digging deeper into declassified cartography archives, I found that the location did exist. In 1972, there was a geological report citing non-standard mineral resonance in that exact range. Then, in 1973, that entire region had been redacted under Operation Mahogany, a classified excavation linked to both biological and seismic testing. After that, nothing. Like someone had taken a blade to the paper trail. Still, I ran the coordinates through my own tools. Satellite renders confirmed an artificial break in the Terrena fault line, too precise to be natural, not a cave, not erosion. Something sealed. I had equipment from past missions, an authorization card with just enough clearance to fabricate a travel order, and 2 weeks of unused field leave. I filed my own report fake, of course claiming a reassessment of old seismic instruments. I chartered a flight under a research alias, and brought only analog tools, nothing traceable. The thumb drive, I kept with me, hidden inside the inner lining of my reinforced field jacket. The deeper part of me, the one that had lived through collapsed mines and biohazard silos, and one oil rig that never should have been reopened, told me to ignore it, to burn the note and walk away. But the code had my name embedded in the checksum string. No one would know that unless they had access to the personnel archive that had been wiped when I was discharged in 2011. It took 3 flights and a 14-hour trek through the most desolate, wind-scoured terrain I've ever seen. No animals. No frost patterns. Just flat gray earth with no memory of rainfall. When I found the location, the first thing I saw wasn't the hatch. It was the silence. You don't notice silence until your own breathing feels invasive. And that was exactly what it was like. Like the landscape didn't want me there. And every step I took was a trespass. I nearly walked past the entrance. It had been overgrown with lichen and mineral dust, covered in what looked like natural erosion. But the shape was wrong. Too circular. Too symmetrical. A faint rectangle jutted from the earth like a scar. I wiped away the topsoil, and there it was. A recessed metallic hatch, flush with the earth, barely visible. No hinges, no handles. Just a smooth industrial finish, dull with age. I didn't need a key. I needed the code. And when I typed it into my analog relay device, a low hum erupted from under the surface, like something ancient was waking up. Not mechanical, but seismic-like. The hatch had been waiting for this moment, and it didn't care who I was. The edges of the seal vibrated, then clicked. Not like a modern magnetic lock. This was older, more primitive. a bolt lock system that ran deep, hydraulic and mechanical in tandem. The hatch lifted half an inch, then stopped, as if expecting a hand to finish the motion. I hesitated, glancing around for motion, any sign that I wasn't alone out there, but the stillness remained. It was that kind of silence that feels so thick, you start to think maybe it's not silence at all. Maybe it's the absence of something else. When I pulled the hatch open, the stench hit me first. Not rot, not mold, but age. Dry age. The kind of air that hasn't moved in decades. Maybe longer. A metallic stairwell descended into blackness, the kind that swallowed light instead of reflecting it. I leaned over the edge, activated my Loam headlamp, and saw only the first few rungs of the ladder. The rest faded into a void I couldn't measure. I set a geolocator beacon at the surface, marked my time stomp, and began the descent. No radio, no uplink, just analog tape. I had no idea what this tunnel had been. No operation name, no active log, no record of construction. But it opened when I arrived, and the only thing that had made that possible was the access code that shouldn't exist in any system and had still found its way to me. And once I crossed below the first rung, I felt it, the shift. The kind of pressure that doesn't come from altitude, or weather or nerves. A presence, not physical, but spatial. Like the air beneath the hatch belonged to something else entirely. I kept going. The last thing I saw before the surface light disappeared was the hatch closing slowly behind me, without sound. Without mechanism, just closing, by itself. The metal beneath my boots was colder than any surface should be, after so much time sealed away from light. Each rung of the ladder felt thinner, more worn than the last, as though countless others had descended before me, pressing their weight into the same path I was now taking, carving imperceptible indentations into iron that no one had touched in decades. I couldn't hear my own breath anymore, at least not as sound. It became something internal, a vibration in my chest, overtaken by the stillness below. There's a point, in long descents, where gravity feels less like a pull, and more like a hand pressing you down, guiding you to places you were not meant to return from. I passed that threshold sometime after the first 40 feet. My light beam grew shorter, not from power loss, but because the darkness itself seemed denser. No dust, no reflection, just an absorption of light like the tunnel was devouring it, molecule by molecule. When I reached the bottom, I expected bedrock, or a chamber. What I found was a corridor not carved, but constructed. The floor was steel-plated, matte and scored in the center, with an old groove that might have been for drainage, or something else entirely. The walls were composite, a type of military-grade laminate I'd seen used in Arctic installations, strong enough to resist pressure shifts, flexible enough to hide seams. But this wasn't standard. The walls weren't modular. They weren't meant to be moved or adjusted. They were fused, like the whole tunnel had been poured in place, and then forgotten. I ran my hand across the surface, and felt the temperature difference immediately. The walls were cold, but the air wasn't. That meant heat was moving through the corridor, being pulled somewhere deeper in. Something was still active down there. To my left, the tunnel stretched into nothing, swallowed by shadow. To my right, a single red diode blinked above a pressure-sealed door. No label, no keypad, no handle. Just a smooth vertical seam, and a tiny panel the size of a coin, inset into the wall beside it. I scanned it. No data, no RFID trace. But the light blinked with a rhythm I recognized, not from military tech, but from something older. Submarine comes. Cold War. Arrow 3 slow. 1 fast. A command respawn signal. I didn't respond. I just stared. My hand hovered near the panel for a full minute, before I stepped back and walked in the opposite direction. The tunnel curved gradually, like a spiral descending inward. No signage, no markings. Just that same groove down the center of the floor, and faint scuffs along the edge of signs that equipment had been moved. Dragged, perhaps, not recently, but not centuries ago either. There were too many straight lines, too much symmetry for this to be accidental. Someone built this for a reason, and then buried it so deeply that only a forgotten access code and a coincidence could uncover it again. I reached a junction after what I estimate was half a mile, though I can't confirm. My analog timekeeper had begun to act erratically, the second hand stuttering in place like it was resisting movement. The junction was a T-shaped split, with both sides ending in heavy doors, identical in structure and composition. On the left, the red light was blinking again, same pattern. On the right, nothing, dead metal. I approached the left door, expecting to feel the warmth of power lines or the vibration of hidden systems. Nothing. The air was still. Unnaturally still, as though the atmosphere didn't circulate past this point. Then I saw it, etched faintly into the upper left corner of the door, barely visible unless the beam hit it just right. Was a series of numbers -hand, -engraved, crude, unaligned. The 6th of November, 2023. That was 3 days ago. Someone had been here, recently. More than that, someone had touched this door, scratched into its surface with enough pressure to leave an imprint, but not enough to trigger a system response. My gloved fingers traced over the date again and again, trying to make sense of it. There had been no sign of other expeditions, no tire tracks, no recent satellite pings in the area, but someone had opened this hatch, descended this ladder, and reached this same junction before me. I backed away slowly and turned to the right-hand door, the one without the light. It was sealed tight, but there was no lock mechanism. I pressed against it. Nothing. I listened. Still nothing. And then, as I turned to step back into the main corridor, I saw the dust pattern on the floor change. I hadn't noticed it before, because it was subtle, too subtle for a draft. The layer of dust that had gathered on the tunnel floor was disturbed in a curve, an arc that ended where my feet had just passed. But the pattern wasn't mine. I'd walked straight. Whatever left that mark had moved in a semicircle. Something else had stepped there. Not boot prints, not shoes. Just a sweep low close to the ground, like something dragging or slithering. I scanned the floor with my light, heart beginning to thud in that familiar deep pattern of pre-fight adrenaline. The dust was fine, granular, untouched by age. No footprints, just that curve. I turned, fast, back toward the way I came. My breath caught. The hatch at the top of the ladder was gone. Not closed, gone. The walls now stretched upward into blackness without end, as though the entry point had never existed. I scanned again. No beacon signal. The locator I'd set topside was no longer pinging. My signal booster had full internal power, but registered 0 reception. Not even static. Just null space. That was the moment I felt the weight of the place. Not emotional, gravitational. Like the tunnel wasn't just sealed, was isolated from physics itself. Suspended in a pocket where time and distance could be rewritten. I tried to access my analog recorder. The tape jammed, not snapped, jammed. Something in the magnetic head had twisted, warped. I had no choice but to continue deeper. Going back was impossible. The tunnel hadn't just hidden the entrance. It had replaced it. The path forward narrowed, subtly at first. The ceiling lowered by a few inches. The groove in the floor deepened, becoming less like a drain and more like a split. Along the right wall, I began to see tiny impressions, scratches, not uniform, not manufactured. They resembled claw marks, but angled wrong for animal movement. Each one was tilted slightly, as if whatever made them had been moving backward or upside down. I stopped to document them with my camera, but when I aimed the lens, the screen blacked out, and the device refused to shutter. No image saved. The scratches only showed to the naked eye. As I walked, the light from my headlamp began to reflect strangely. Not from metal or moisture, but from a strange shimmer along the left-hand wall, like heat distortion, but without warmth. It danced at the edges of my vision, and every time I turned to face it directly, it vanished. But I could hear something now, faint but growing. A distant hum, like machinery left running too long in standby mode, resonating deep in the structure itself. Then, for the first time, I saw movement. Just a flicker. A shadow along the seam of the wall ahead. Not human-shaped, not animal, just wrong. Geometry that didn't belong in motion. The hatch beneath the dust had not been a relic. It was an invitation, and I had accepted. I kept walking. It was only after the shimmer vanished that I realized how far I had come, how deep below the earth I already was. There was no sense of time here, only distance, and even that was beginning to warp. My watch was dead, my pulse unreadable on the biometric strap, and every step felt like it carried more weight than the one before. Not from exhaustion, but from something else. The pressure. Not physically at least, not in any way I could measure, but perceptual. like walking deeper into a place that didn't want me to be aware of the route I was taking. The path behind me no longer felt familiar, even though I had just come through it. I turned to look back and saw only shadow. The shimmer was gone, and in its place was an absence, not of light, but of direction. I adjusted my headlamp and continued forward, letting the groove in the floor guide me. It had widened now, no longer a thin drainage line but a visible trench with beveled edged steel. Deliberate, meant to carry something long and heavy, or perhaps to catch something before it could leave. The walls had begun to change too. The smooth composite surface was giving way to panel segments, slightly mismatched, covered in dustless grime. Something had moved along them recently, and not slowly. On one section, I spotted what looked like an impact markerburst fracture in the plating that spidered out from a central dent, as if something with immense force had slammed into it from inside the tunnel. Not a tool mark, not demolition. Like something had tried to break out. I passed the damage without stopping, but I felt it in my spine. The way one feels the aftermath of a fight without seeing it, the residue of violence baked into air. A little further along, my headlamp dimmed and flickered. Not failed, just dimmed gradually, as if something was siphoning its power. I checked the backup cells. Fully charged, not drawing current. The light should have been bright, white, clinical. It now had a greenish tinge, not from the LED itself, but from the environment. The walls were absorbing color. Everything around me had taken on the hue of old bile and oxidized metal, a palette that made skin look sick and shadows look alive. Then came the drop. The tunnel had appeared to remain flat, but I now realized the slope had been incremental. So shallow as to escape notice, unless you were looking for it. I wasn't, but my knees began to strain differently. The way you notice a ramp only when your legs disagree. Then the ramp steepened, and the air changed. Not its smell, but its consistency. Thicker, not humid, not chemical, denser. Like the molecules were closer together here, as if gravity had been adjusted slightly, like stepping into a chamber pressurized for something not entirely human. My lungs expanded more slowly, not painfully, just wrong. I had the sudden instinct to cough, but I held it back. Sound felt dangerous here. I descended in silence, one hand trailing the right wall for orientation. That's when I first noticed the light, not mine. A glow ahead, faint amber, pulsing. I slowed. The tunnel was narrowing. My shoulders nearly brushed both walls. Then, just before I reached the source, my headlamp shut off. No stutter, no dimming. Just absolute dark. I froze and listened. The pulse of light ahead continued, rhythmic, mechanical, like an old signal beacon that had never received the order to stop. I reached for the emergency light strip in my utility pouch and cracked it open. The chemical reaction glowed soft blue for a moment, then flickered. Another pulse from the light ahead, and the blue went dark. Interference. Not electromagnetic. Not static. Something environmental, perhaps deliberate. I was being asked to walk blind, so I did. 5 steps forward, the light grew stronger, but not clearer. It came from behind a translucent partition. A door. No, a shield. The kind used in laboratories or test chambers, to observe without risking exposure. There were smudges on it, not fingerprints, streaks. Long, curved, erratic, as if someone or something had pressed against it repeatedly. Beyond the partition, I saw movement. Slow, not shuffling, but swaying. I adjusted my stance, trying to look past the glow. And then I saw the source. A rotating cylinder in the center of a large, circular chamber, bathed in that amber light. It was turning too perfectly. Not a motor, no hum, no vibration. It was suspended, levitating, or balanced on something invisible. I couldn't tell. Around it, half shrouded, were shapes. Too big to be people. Racks, containers, or something else stored vertically. I approached the partition and reached for a terminal embedded in the wall. It powered on without touch. The screen displayed no menu, just text, single line, flashing, observation active, do not enter. Then the screen blanked, and a countdown began, 0:19, 0:18, 0:17. I stepped back. My instincts screamed at me to run, but there was nowhere to go. The countdown reached 0 o'clock and stopped. Nothing happened. Then the light changed, from amber to red. The rotating cylinder halted in place. A hiss emerged, low and wet, not from gas, but from something alive. One of the tall shapes moved. A vertical shudder, like a spine readjusting. My breath caught. I remained frozen. Then came the sound. A scrape against metal, high and dry, followed by a thud not heavy, but final. The partition fogged over completely, and the glow behind it dimmed. I stepped away carefully, and continued down the descending path. The next stretch of tunnel was completely dark. No lights, no signals, just faint air movement, as if I was now beneath a system of vents, or above something hollow. My boots echoed. That was new. The floor had been solid until now. This section had space beneath. Cavities. I thought of reservoirs, storage tanks, burial chambers, things you seal underground when you want them never to be found. I tested the metal with a light stomp. It rang dull and flat, but the echo came back delayed. Something deep, possibly fluid. Not water. Something thicker. I kept moving, and then the tunnel opened again abruptly into a new space. This time, no partition, no door. Just a widening of the path into a chamber lined with equipment I couldn't immediately identify. Workstations, perhaps monitoring bays, all long dead. The air here was stale, in a different way. Not aged, but repurposed. Recycled too many times. I approached a console covered in dust, wiped it, and found a badge wedged in the corner. Plastic laminate, cracked and faded. The photo was gone, peeled away. The name was scratched out. Only the clearance level remained. CIVL 4D. Civilian, level 4 deep. That was the highest clearance I'd ever seen outside military black projects. And someone had been here with it. Something was happening in this facility. Something that had gone so deep and so wrong that even the walls were trying to forget. My light returned suddenly, as if re-permitted, a flicker, then steady beam. But my comfort lasted half a second. Because the floor just ahead of me bore a new mark. A footprint fresh, not mine, barefoot wide, with toes that weren't shaped right. There was no dust inside it. The surrounding floor was dusty. This print was clean, which meant something had just walked through here. Which meant I wasn't alone. And still descending. There is a specific kind of silence that only exists in man-made spaces, long since abandoned and engineered void, where nothing moves. Not because it's naturally still, but because everything that once gave it purpose has either died or been forcibly removed. That was the silence I stepped into after the footprint. It didn't matter that the print itself was impossible wide. Barefoot, too long, the toes stretched like a gecko's butt. What froze me wasn't its shape. It was its presence, the cleanness, the freshness. Something was here. Very recently, and it had come through the tunnel I had just entered, moving without dust, without trace, without sound. I stared at it for longer than I should have, then lifted my light and scanned the floor ahead. More prints. Not many, but enough to track a single direction, deeper, always deeper. The corridor narrowed again, subtly, and the groove in the center floor disappeared for the first time since my descent. That disturbed me more than the footprints. The groove had become a constant, like a trail I could pretend was part of some engineered utility design. But its absence now suggested I had moved beyond the designed part of this structure. I wasn't in the system anymore. I was below it. The architecture changed. The clean composite panels gave way to raw, concrete-like surfaces, but not concrete. Something older, coarser, embedded with filaments I couldn't identify thin metallic veins running beneath. The surface like a buried circulatory system. The walls were slightly curved, the ceiling lower, making me hunch as I walked. This place was not built for comfort, or for the living. I paused at one corner where the floor dipped, noting a small panel set into the wall. It was analog, a rotary switch, like from old substation control rooms, with faded stencils in a language I didn't recognize. Not Cyrillic, not Latin. Something modular, geometric, unflowing. I traced the lines with my glove, and felt a faint heat pulsing behind them, like the wall itself still breathed, albeit slowly, like a body in induced coma. Further along, the tunnel bent in unnatural angles, 30 degrees left, then 22 right, as if dodging something that no longer existed. These were not construction choices made for efficiency or terrain. They were deviations, purposeful redirections. I wondered briefly if the entire layout was a maze, not to trap something within, but to mislead anything or anyone that made it this far. And then I found the door. It wasn't a door in the traditional sense. There was no handle, no visible mechanism. Just a perfectly vertical seam in the stone-like material, 2 panels meeting flush with almost surgical precision. The space around it was bare, except for one thing. A handprint etched into the wall beside it. Not raised, not recessed, just scorched. As if someone had pressed their palm against the surface with impossible heat and left behind a perfect silhouette. Fingers outstretched, thumb broken at the joint. The scorch was fresh. I reached toward it, hovered my own gloved hand above the mark, and felt the warmth still radiating, faint and pulsing. I didn't touch it. I didn't need to. The panel hissed open on its own. No noise, no light. Just a slow parting of the seam, like lungs inhaling for the first time in years. Beyond the door was a corridor even darker than before, lined with what looked like support struts but wrong, too close together, like ribs. I stepped inside, and the walls curved again, this time inward, forming a claustrophobic tunnel that swallowed my light within 6 feet. I kept going. I had no choice. There was no turning back now, not because I couldn't, but because the way back had stopped existing the moment that door opened. I could feel it behind me gone, as if the tunnel had folded in on itself. I walked for what felt like hours. My breath slowed. My thoughts fragmented. Time didn't pass. It hovered. At some point, I emerged into a wider chamber. Circular, with 8 doorways, only one of which had light bleeding through the seams. I approached that one, knowing full well it was a trap, that it was designed to draw me in precisely because it broke the pattern. The light was red, pulsing, familiar in rhythm. 3 slow, 1 fast, same as the blinking diode at the hatch. This wasn't random, it was the same system, repeating itself like a memory. The door opened before I could touch it. Inside was a room I can only describe as an observation cell. One wall entirely made of darkened glass. On the opposite side, a chair bolted to the floor, and above it, what I initially thought was a mirror. I stepped in. The door closed silently behind me. I heard it lock. The red light shifted to amber. The room lit gradually, revealing the reflection not of myself, but of the chair. It was empty, but not unmarked. The restraints were worn, the leather cracked. There were indentations where limbs had sat too long. A table beside the chair held fragments, bones, I think, but carved, almost polished. Not for ritual, for study. I approached the glass. It shifted suddenly and became transparent. On the other side was another room, identical, but occupied. A figure stood there, facing away, tall, gaunt, naked. Its skin was pale to the point of translucency, stretched tight across visible bone, as if dehydrated or never meant to be fleshy in the first place. It didn't move, but I could feel it knowing I was there. Then, as if cued, it turned its head, not its body, just the head slowly. The vertebrae in its neck shifting in a way that was too fluid. It had no eyes, just hollows. Deep, wide, empty. But it saw me. Not through vision, through recognition. It took a step forward. I stumbled back. The room dimmed again. The glass clouded, and the door behind me unlocked. I ran, back into the tunnel. The hallway now pulsed with the same rhythm. 3 slow, 1 fast. Lights embedded in the walls had come alive, guiding me. But guiding me where? Every step forward now echoed. Every breath behind me doubled. The tunnel that hadn't existed on any map was no longer silent. It was breathing with me, matching me, as if it had always been alive, just waiting for someone to awaken it. I was deep beneath the world now. Deeper than any system still recognized. Deeper than any mission would authorize. I wasn't an intruder. I was the ignition. And the thing that had seen me had only just begun to move. The corridor behind me seemed to collapse in the recesses of my mind the moment I crossed the threshold into the next space. As if whatever architectural logic governed the structure shifted and rewrote itself in real time. The tunnel no longer echoed sound, was devoured rather than bounced. My footsteps lost their cadence, absorbed into the air like water into cloth, and the more I walked, the more I felt like I was not just underground, but beneath even that, nestled in something older than earth, and colder than metal. It wasn't cold in temperature, but in intent. This place, was sterile not because it lacked life, but because it had once been filled with something that had since been scraped out with precision. The walls now bore texture-layered panels, irregular seams, and signs of retrofitting. Someone had tried to reinforce this section, not to preserve it, but to contain it. I counted at least 4 types of fastener on a single bulkhead: hex bolts, weld marks, clamps, and something that looked like fused resin, melted into place, with pressure instead of heat. No institution does that, unless it's reacting to failure. That's the truth of engineering under duress. Improvisation replaces protocol. The air pressure shifted again, as I passed beneath a narrow steel arch, embedded with faded stenciling symbols, that had once been red now oxidized into brown scars. Unreadable, but rhythmic, like language designed for function rather than understanding. Beyond the arch was the first chamber. It wasn't large, perhaps 8 meters across, 5 deep, but it had that unmistakable presence of a room meant to be occupied for reasons no one liked. A light fixture still hung from the ceiling, swinging very slightly, too slightly for any breeze. That was the first thing that told me the room was still alive. The second was the writing, not on the walls, on the floor. Handwritten, scraped, scrawled into the plating beneath a thin layer of grime. The letters were long, erratic, with pressure marks that gouged into metal rather than simply marking it. There were multiple layers, one set clearly etched by a hand in panic. Uneven and almost childlike, spelling the same 3 words over and over in a language I recognized but barely understood. It remembers us. The phrase repeated, overlapping itself, then devolving into symbols that were less like letters and more like attempted replication. Someone was trying to copy a language they couldn't read. Or perhaps they were trying to write what they saw. Beside that, another message, much more structured, was burned into a floor plate near the center of the room. This one had spacing, alignment, and intentionality. The letters were in English, scratched with something precise and sharp. They read, "Do not trust the reflection. It will lie to return." I stood there, reading those words over and over, trying to extract meaning from syntax that didn't follow any psychological breakdown I'd learned in field analysis. The reflection, lie to return. What had happened in this room? It wasn't a cell. It had no restraints, no glass, no surveillance nodes. But there were signs of occupancy: peeling insulation on the back wall, where someone had leaned or paced. A small box in the far corner, containing what looked like the remains of a personal kit, a worn cloth patch with a faded insignia, a broken pencil with gnawed edges, and a data slate with its screen shattered from within. I picked it up carefully, turned it over. On the reverse was a nameplate scratched into the frame. Wells, J, Tech 3. No record of that designation appeared in any military contractor database I'd ever seen. Not civilian, not defense. And yet the format of the tag was familiar, down to the slash between rank and assignment. This was built for internal compartmentalization. As I turned the device over again, something clicked, soft, mechanical, deliberate. The light above me stopped swinging, not slowed, stopped. Frozen in place mid-motion, as though gravity had been redefined just for it. I stared up at it. A faint sound hummed behind the wall. I turned, tracing the source. One of the wall panels now bore a hairline fracture that hadn't been there moments ago. Behind it, light leaked through. Not electric. Organic. It pulsed like a vein, faint, warm, the same amber as before, but this time steady. I approached slowly. The writing on the floor seemed to vibrate in my periphery, but every time I looked down, the letters were still screaming, still overlapping. I placed my hand against the fractured panel. It was warm to the touch. Then I heard the voice, not through my ears, through bone. It began as a low vibration in my fingertips, traveling up my arm, becoming more coherent with each joint it passed, until it reached my jaw. Then it spoke not in language, but in mimicry. My own voice, whispering a phrase I had never said, but recognized. If you leave now, it will follow others. If you stay, it will only take you. I yanked my hand back. The fracture sealed itself with a hiss. The light behind it faded, and the temperature dropped instantly. Something had just interacted with me. Something that was aware of my thoughts, my voice, my presence. Not because I had introduced myself, but because it had been waiting. And now it had found the right imprint to match. I backed away toward the chamber's threshold, stepping over the writing again. But as I did, the words shifted. My foot brushed a layer of grime loose, revealing a new set of marks underneath. Smaller, tighter, carved with something finer than a tool, perhaps a nail or teeth. They formed a single sentence. Don't look for the exit. IT's part of IT now. That was when I noticed the camera. It had been mounted high in the corner of the room, recessed into the paneling, coated in dust but active. A tiny red light blinked once, acknowledging my awareness of it, and then it stopped. This place was being watched. Or had been. Or thought it still was. I stepped back into the corridor. The door to the room did not close. It stayed open, silent and waiting, like a wound that never clotted. I marked its location on my mental map, even knowing that maps no longer mattered here. The tunnel ahead curved left, then right, each turn smaller than the last, forming a spiral. I counted 12 turns before I realized I was descending again, even without stairs or ramp. The floor had angled without me noticing. The air grew denser. My vision sharpened despite the dimness, like something in the environment was dilating my perception. And in that moment I understood the message. The reflection was not a mirror. It was a return function, a mimic, a loop. Whatever lived down here didn't just remember. It reconstructed. It didn't record voices. It became them. And I was no longer sure that the thoughts in my mind were exclusively mine. Somewhere between the narrowing of the corridor and the emergence of the next chamber, the sound began. I didn't notice it at first because it came so subtly, so naturally. Like a subconscious heartbeat barely distinguishable from the natural echo of my own footsteps. At first it was distant 3 slow clicks, then a pause, then another 3 clicks, again and again, always measured, never frantic, not loud, not threatening. But there was something deeply wrong in the symmetry. Like a pattern that didn't belong in this place but had somehow been carved into its infrastructure. Not by code or by design, but by persistence. A memory that had become physical, that kept repeating itself long after it should have faded. I paused. The sound stopped with me. I took another step, and there it was, again 3 slow taps, exactly mirroring my pace. I turned off my headlamp to test the silence. My own breath filled the void for a few seconds, thick and steady. Then click, click, click again. Not my footsteps, not echo. Something mimicking. I leaned toward the wall, pressed my ear against it, and the cold that met my skin wasn't just temperature, it was intent. Like the wall itself had been storing pressure, and now let it bleed through contact. Behind it, I heard the clicks not as sharp as before, but lower now. Like something pressing into metal from the other side, with calculated patience. The kind of patience that implies watching. I stepped back. My boots left impressions in the thin dust coating the floor still. No disturbance ahead of me. No footprints, no signs of other life, but the sense of being observed was overwhelming now. Not paranoia, awareness. There's a threshold every operative learns to identify when the air changes, not because of altitude or pressure, but because someone or something has assigned you a value. You are no longer neutral in the environment. You are being categorized, tagged. I continued down the corridor. The sound continued with me. At times, it shifted locations behind me, beside me. Once even above, but always the same rhythm. 3 clicks, pause, 3 clicks. Eventually, I stopped reacting. It didn't change anything. Reacting didn't make it closer or further. It was already in step with me, whether I acknowledged it or not. That was when the hallway changed again. The walls curved inward, almost imperceptibly, until the floor felt concaved beneath me, and I realized I was walking on a subtle trough, as if the structure was funneling me, not guiding, draining. The groove had returned beneath my feet, but now it wasn't centered. It twisted slightly, curving right like the pull of gravity was being redirected. My orientation began to slip. My sense of forward wasn't aligned with the walls anymore. Everything had become subtly off-center. The air was still breathable, but heavier with each breath, like breathing through cloth soaked in salt water. I checked the oxygen scrubber built into my field rig, still operational, green status. The environment hadn't changed. I had. The corridor eventually led to a room, if it could still be called that. The architecture no longer resembled anything structural. It was too open, too irregular, as though it had been carved instead of built. The floor was uneven, the ceiling just high enough to cause vertigo, and there were ridges along the walls that shimmered under low light, like scales or sedimentary layers. It felt geologic but alive, like the inside of something's ribcage fossilized in place. The center of the room held a pedestal, not ceremonial, not decorative, purely functional. On it rested a device I recognized immediately, despite never having seen it in person. A military-grade acoustic resonator, Model 6 VR, outdated, no longer in use, except in some decommissioned underwater surveillance stations. It was built to detect low-frequency anomalies across hundreds of kilometers, specifically in dense environments, ocean floors, ice shelves, cavern systems. It shouldn't be here. The device was on. Lights blinked across its interface, amber, green, and red in no particular sequence. And above all, it was listening. A microphone extension extended upward like a small antenna, oscillating gently, as if following movement I couldn't see. I stepped closer and checked the analog recorder embedded in the console. The tape was spinning, not fast, not erratically, just steady. I leaned in and pressed play. For a moment, nothing. Then the sound of static. Then the clicks, 3 pause, 3 pause repeating, but not like what I had heard in the corridor. This was slower, sharper, recorded intentionally, and layered beneath the clicks, something else. Breathing, shallow, broken, but rhythmic. And then a voice, low, male, tired, beyond comprehension. They never stopped clicking. It learns through rhythm, through mirror, through mimic. If you answer, if you respond, it takes you in pieces. The tape cut out. I stood there, unsure whether to take the recording with me or destroy it. My fingers hovered over the console. Then the device shifted slightly, turning toward me of its own accord, as though aligning to my shape. I stepped back. The ambient light in the chamber began to pulse in time with the clicks, but not visually through vibration. The ground itself was sinking to the rhythm, making my bones vibrate against my muscles. I realized the sound wasn't following me. It was inside me now. I turned away and saw something carved into the wall behind the pedestal, jagged and crude, likely done with fingernails or something sharp and personal. Not a symbol, a diagram, a circle with arrows pointing inward. A mouth, and inside it, rows and rows of smaller circles, like teeth. Underneath, a message in the same hand. It speaks by echoing. If you answer, you become the sound. I left the room quickly, but the resonance didn't. The frequency had tuned into my heartbeat. I could feel it when I blinked, when I clenched my jaw. It was a parasite of pattern, and it had chosen me, not by accident, not at random. I had descended too far, seen too much. I was part of its memory now, or maybe it had become part of mine. As I re-entered the corridor, the sound returned, now louder. 3 clicks, then 3 more. Then, for the first time, 4. It had changed. It had evolved. And it was listening for a response. The rhythmic clicks echoed in my ears as I moved through the dim corridor, the pattern now irregular. No longer the predictable sequence of 3 slow taps followed by a pause. The variation was subtle but unmistakable, a shift in cadence. A variation in intensity that felt like a heartbeat with arrhythmia. A signal trying to communicate in a language I was only beginning to decipher. The wall seemed to close in with every step, the space growing tighter, the air heavier with an unspoken warning. And then I saw it, a door standing ajar where no door should have been. I know the maps. I have every layout of this complex archived. Every blueprint from every declassified mission. There was no door here. Never was. The walls had been solid, seamless. Yet here it was, the metal frame gleaming faintly, the edge of the door glowing with an unnatural sheen, as if it had been recently polished or ... used. My hand hesitated near the cold surface, the unnatural glow beckoning and warning at the same time. I'd been taught in training that an open door in a secure area is always a bad sign, but this was more than that. It was a rift in reality, a violation of order. I glanced behind me. The corridor was unchanged. The faint glow of the emergency lights dim, the air still dense and stale. But I could feel a new energy emanating from this space, a vibration that resonated deep in my bones. I stepped forward, and the door creaked open wider with a sound that should have been impossible. Slow, deliberate, and eerily alive, like the breathing of a wounded beast. Inside, the room was larger than I expected. Rectangular, lined with dark panels that absorbed light rather than reflected it. The floor was rough concrete, stained and cracked, with shards of metal and glass scattered around as though the space had been abandoned in haste or ransacked by something violent. The atmosphere was thick, charged with an oppressive weight that made every breath a labor. The shadows moved strangely here, flickering and undulating without source, as if the room itself was warping the very essence of light and space. Then I saw the floor. The ground was littered with scraps of expired ration packs, some torn open, others still sealed. I knelt, picking up a packet marked U.S. Army MRE. Date, 1996. The edges were brittle, the packaging cracked, but a faint warmth radiated from inside one of the unopened packs. I pulled it closer to my face and saw a thin, curling vapor escaping through a tiny hole in the seal. It was warm, too warm. Impossible for something that should have been inert for decades. I dropped it immediately, the packet hissing faintly as it settled back onto the floor. Whatever chemical reaction was inside was still active, defying logic, defying decay. My attention shifted to the far wall, where a series of monitors hung, cracked and frozen on static, their screens flickering with intermittent bursts of green code and distorted images. Among them, one displayed a live feed, albeit scrambled and glitching, of the very room I was in. The camera angle was fixed, positioned high in a corner I hadn't noticed. The feed blurred momentarily, then sharpened. For a heartbeat, I saw something in the room with me. Not a shadow, not a trick of light. Something solid, vaguely humanoid, but disproportionate. Too tall, too thin, with limbs that seemed elongated and articulated in ways that defied anatomy. It stood motionless, watching. And then it vanished. I stumbled back, heart pounding, and my gaze darted around, searching for an exit or a place to hide. The door behind me slammed shut, not with mechanical force, but as if the room itself exhaled and closed its lungs. The monitors flickered violently, and then all went dark. The only illumination came from the dim emergency light overhead, casting long, twitching shadows across the walls. I could feel the presence again, closer now, more tangible, pressing in from all sides. A sudden noise shattered the tense silencer, scraping sound, like nails or claws against metal, echoing from somewhere within the chamber. The sound was irregular, jerky, and deeply unsettling. It was coming from beneath the floor. I dropped to my knees, pressing my ear to the cold concrete. Beneath the surface, the scraping continued, moving slowly across some hidden surface, approaching, retreating, circling. It was deliberate, it was aware, it was waiting. I scrambled to my feet and approached the monitors again, desperate to find some clue, some signal. I pressed a button on the console, hoping to reboot the system or access any logs. The screen flickered back on, displaying lines of text in a broken, corrupted format. Among the garbled data, one message repeated over and over. Do not trust what you hear. It mimics to return. My blood ran cold. The sound beneath the floor, the presence in the shadows, it was imitating something, someone. It was learning. Suddenly, the lights dimmed further, and the temperature dropped sharply. My breath became visible in the stale air, each exhale a small cloud of mist. The monitors went dark again, plunging the room into near total blackness. Only the faintest glow from the exit sign flickered weakly overhead. Then the scraping stopped, and the room was silent. Too silent. The kind of silence that fills the air before a storm. I took a step toward the door, my hand outstretched, fingers brushing the cold metal handle. A shudder ran through the floor, subtle but undeniable, like the heartbeat of the tunnel itself. My vision blurred at the edges, and I realized with sudden clarity that I was no longer alone. Behind me, the air shifted. A cold breath whispered past my neck, carrying with it a voice not spoken, but felt. A resonance inside my skull that bypassed hearing and went straight to the mind. Come closer. I froze, the words pulsing through me in waves. The presence was near, unseen but palpable, filling the room with an unseen weight. My fingers tightened on the handle as I fought the urge to flee, to turn and run back into the corridor that had become my prison. But the door didn't budge. It was locked. not by any mechanical means, but by will, by something alive. And as the room plunged deeper into darkness, I understood that whatever had opened this door had done so for a reason that involved me. The oppressive darkness of the sealed chamber clung to my skin as I forced myself to steady my breathing and refocus my senses. The stale air, heavy with the scent of rust and decay, was interrupted only by the faint sound of my own heartbeat pounding in my ears. I reached into my pack and pulled out the small chemical light strip, snapping it to life with a muted hiss that felt far too loud in the silence. The cool blue glow cast long trembling shadows that danced across the walls and ceiling, illuminating the room in an eerie, unnatural light. I took a tentative step forward, the scuffed floor crunching faintly beneath my boots as I scanned the space for any sign of life or movement. My eyes settled on a cluster of objects haphazardly strewn across the concrete floor. As I approached, I recognized them immediately: military ration packs. The plastic casings were cracked and yellowed with age, some torn open and scattered as though hastily discarded. The labels bore faded dates stamped firmly in black ink, 1996. My fingers trembled slightly as I reached down and picked up one of the sealed packs, its surface oddly warm to the touch, radiating a faint, curling vapor that slipped silently into the heavy air. That warmth defied every rational explanation, every law of preservation and decay I'd ever known. How could something sealed so long ago still be active, still radiating heat like fresh food? I dropped it hastily, the pack letting out a barely audible hiss as it settled back onto the ground. The room itself seemed to contract and expand with my rising panic. I wiped a layer of dust from a second ration pack and noticed a thin film of moisture collected beneath the plastic wet, enough to glisten, to sparkle faintly in the glow of my chemical light. My fingers hovered over it, unwilling to touch, but unable to look away. That moisture was too fresh, too immediate. It wasn't condensation from the air. It was exudate, a secretion of something alive and unseen. I took another step deeper into the chamber, the walls closing in, and the temperature fluctuating sharply with every footfall. My eyes caught the glint of metal across the room. Moving closer, I discovered a small half-buried crate with its lid cracked open, revealing a tangled mess of wires and circuit boards, an impromptu control panel that had been jury-rigged to something larger beneath the floor. My pulse quickened as I crouched down to inspect the makeshift electronics. The wires hummed faintly, pulsing with a low-frequency current that seemed too rhythmic, too purposeful. I reached out, careful to avoid the exposed copper, and pressed a single button on a cracked circuit board. The humming rose briefly, then fell into silence as the panel powered down. At the far end of the chamber, obscured by shadow and the angle of my light, I noticed a small, partially open hatch embedded in the floor. The edges were worn but freshly disturbed, the paint chipped away and smeared with an unknown substance. My breath hitched as I knelt and wiped the grime away from the latch, revealing a set of claw marks not from any animal I recognized, but something larger and more deliberate. The hatch creaked open under my touch, revealing a narrow ladder descending into absolute darkness. I hesitated only a moment before securing my light and beginning the descent. Each rung groaned beneath my weight, the walls closing in around me as I plunged deeper into the abyss. The stale air was replaced by a cold, wet chill that seeped into my bones, the scent shifting to something metallic and faintly organic. I stopped near the bottom, where the ladder ended abruptly into a cavernous chamber lined with pipes and cables, snaking along the walls like the veins of some ancient beast. In the center of the room stood a large metal container, its surface corroded but intact. The faint glow from my light revealed a small opening at the top, through which a thin plume of vapor escaped in slow, rhythmic bursts. I reached out to touch it, and recoiled as the metal surface was warm beneath my gloves, alive, pulsating with an internal heat that defied explanation. The container hummed softly, a low thrum that reverberated through the floor and into my chest. Suddenly, the air shifted, and I heard it, a whispering sound, too faint to be human, yet unmistakably intelligent. The voice was fragmented, a series of broken syllables and murmurs that echoed through the chamber like a half-remembered dream. My heart pounded in response, the warmth from the container spreading through my fingertips as if it were breathing beneath the metal shell. I backed away slowly, the chemical light sputtering and dimming as I ascended the ladder, the whispers fading into silence. Reaching the main chamber once more, I spotted a crumpled notebook lying near the scattered rations. I picked it up carefully, flipping through the yellowed pages covered in frantic handwriting. The words were fragmented, scribbled in a mixture of technical jargon and desperate pleas. The compound keeps them awake. The bodies don't follow. The mind is active, but lost in darkness. We can't stop it. It learns. It adapts. The warmth is a sign. They are not dead. Not alive. They wait. The room felt suddenly colder, the weight of unseen eyes pressing down on me as I realized that whatever this compound was, it had changed everything it touched. The expired rations, still warm and seeping, were not remnants of the past. They were part of an ongoing presence, a lingering echo of something that refused to die. I tucked the notebook into my jacket and moved toward the hatch once more, the rhythmic clicking sound from earlier returning in my mind. Whatever was down here was waiting, watching, learning, and perhaps even feeding off the warmth that defied death itself. The corridor outside beckoned, its shadows shifting and alive, promising more answers, or more questions. I had descended past the last light, but the darkness ahead was far from empty. Descending deeper into the labyrinth beneath the earth, I had convinced myself that sound would be my ally, my tether to reality as the shadows stretched and twisted around me like living things. But what I encountered was neither ally nor enemy, but a mirror of something far darker. Myself, fractured and echoed in the hollow depths. It began innocuously, a faint distortion caught on the edges of my hearing, like static wrapping around a distant radio signal, fragile and ephemeral. I dismissed it as fatigue, the consequence of hours spent underground, the inevitable fraying of nerves. But as the sound grew clearer, more insistent, I realized it was no accident. The sound was my own voice. At first, the echoes were benign, fragments of my last spoken words bouncing back from some hidden chamber. A whispered okay, a sharp intake of breath, the subtle shift of my boots on concrete. But as I pressed on, the recordings began to change, twisting and warping into phrases I had never uttered, words foreign and chilling that I could feel but not understand. I stopped, reaching into my jacket for the audio recorder, a battered device from years ago that still offered some comfort in its analog simplicity. I played back the last minutes of my journey, and there it was. My voice, yes, but layered and distorted. Some phrases stretched into groans, others chopped and rearranged like a broken song. The inflections were wrong, the emotions mismatched. Where I had spoken calm, the playback screamed despair. I felt the hairs on the back of my neck rise as the room filled with a low, rhythmic thrum. It was as if the tunnel itself had learned my cadence, my tone, and now mocked me, folding my essence into its dark fabric. The voice drifted from my recorder into the air, surrounding me, enveloping me in a cacophony of whispers and cries that were both me and not me. I staggered back, heart hammering, and the light of my headlamp wavered as the walls around me seemed to pulse, alive with unseen rhythms. In the midst of the chaos, a phrase surfaced, repeated in a loop, chilling in its clarity. If you speak, it listens. If you listen, it speaks. If you answer, you stay. I understood then that this place was not just a structure, but a trap-a-hall of mirrors built from sound and memory. A prison woven from the very essence of identity. The voice was a siren, a lure, a predator masquerading as the familiar. I tried to silence the recorder, but the device resisted, buttons unresponsive. The tape spinning endlessly, as though powered by the tunnel's will. Desperate, I crushed it beneath my boot, shattering plastic and metal, but the echoes persisted. Now indistinguishable from my own thoughts, invading the sanctity of my mind. Every step forward became a negotiation with the specters of my voice. Every breath, a battle against the rising tide of fractured sound. The walls grew tighter, the air thicker, and the rhythm of the clicks shifted again, now interspersed with faint laughter, broken and distorted. I covered my ears, but the noise was inside me, reverberating through my skull, echoing in the hollow chambers of my bones. I realized with horror that the voice was learning, adapting, evolving, feeding on my presence to deepen its hold. Suddenly, the corridor opened into a circular chamber, bathed in cold, bluish light emanating from unseen sources. At the center stood a monolithic console, its surfaces etched with indecipherable symbols that glowed faintly, pulsing in time with the dissonant chorus of voices. I approached cautiously, my footsteps swallowed by the hum of machinery and madness. The console displayed a distorted waveform, my voice, analyzed and dissected into spectral fragments. Adjacent to it, A screen flickered to life, revealing a looping video feed. Me. Moving through the tunnels, unaware that I was being observed, studied, replicated. The image blurred and morphed, doubling into countless versions of myself, each trapped in an eternal echo chamber. I realized then that the tunnel's heart was not mechanical or biological, but mimetic, a self-sustaining loop of sound and image designed to consume and replicate consciousness. It fed on identity, fragmenting and absorbing those who entered, trapping them in an endless cycle of reflection and distortion. Panic surged as the door behind me sealed shut with a resonant thud. The chamber grew colder, the light dimming to an abyssal black. The voices crescendoed into a cacophony of anguish and desire, and I understood the truth. I was becoming part of the tunnel's endless symphony, my essence folding into its eternal loop. Desperation lent me strength. I lunged for a panel beside the console, tearing at wires and forcing circuits to overload. Sparks flew, and the chamber shuddered as systems faltered. The voices wavered, then began to fade, replaced by a deep, sonorous silence that pressed against my ears like a weight. The console powered down. The lights went out, and in the silence that followed, I heard only my own breath, free, unbroken, real. For a moment, then the clicks began again. I had always believed that maps were the most reliable evidence we had carefully drawn, verified, updated with military precision to account for every inch of known territory. But here, deep beneath the earth, in a place that seemed to defy all reason and logic, those blueprints betrayed me. The corridor I had just traversed, the chamber where my voice had been twisted into an endless loop. Even the sealed hatch that swallowed the surface, it was all missing. As if the architects of this place had deliberately erased parts of their own creation from every record, every chart, every digital archive. A void not just in space, but in memory. After escaping the looping chamber, I found a stairwell hidden behind a false panel. The metal was cold and smooth, its edges polished to a mirror sheen despite the years it must have lain untouched. Descending the narrow steps, I emerged into a cavernous space illuminated by emergency lights that flickered weakly, casting long shadows that danced on the walls like restless spirits. At the far end stood a control room, a sanctum of faded technology and forgotten protocols. Its walls lined with consoles cracked and coated in dust, displays long dead but still humming faintly with residual power. I approached one of the primary consoles, its screen flickering to life as I brushed away the grime. The display showed schematics, maps, cross-sections, engineering data, yet the sections corresponding to my current location were conspicuously absent. Entire swaths of the underground complex were redacted, obscured with digital blackouts and cryptic annotations. Classified, redacted, silent protocols. The section where I now stood was one of them. The record simply ceased. The tunnel I had entered was unmarked, unregistered, erased from every official ledger. My fingers traced the blank space on the screen, the cold glow reflecting in my eyes. The absence was too deliberate to be accidental. Someone had wanted this section to be forgotten, or never found. I pulled out the faded schematics I had brought, a collection compiled from decades of declassified missions and exploratory surveys, and compared them to the control room's digital archives. Every known passage was accounted for, every chamber logged, every hatch numbered, except the one I had traversed. It was a ghost in the system. I scoured the nearby consoles for any log entries, transmissions, or notes that might explain this anomaly. Most files were corrupted or encrypted beyond my clearance. But one terminal yielded a fragment, a recorded transmission, garbled but discernible. The voice was distorted, clipped, speaking in hushed urgency. ... Section compromised. Breach imminent. ... Protocol failed. Containment lost. Evacuation initiated. ... The message cut out abruptly, replaced by static and silence. I felt a chill creep down my spine. The breach, the failure. This place was more than a hidden tunnel, it was a containment zone, a prison for something that was not meant to escape. As I delved deeper into the control room, I discovered logs, detailing experiments, conducted decades ago, biological research, psychological studies, acoustic weapon testing. The entries were clinical, devoid of empathy, cataloging symptoms and behaviors with cold precision. But one phrase recurred in multiple reports, scrawled hastily in margins and footnotes: the entity adapts through mimicry. It learns through silence and sound. The containment is unstable. I realized then that the missing section in the blueprints was not an oversight but a deliberate attempt to erase the memory of a failure. An acknowledgement that the entity trapped here had broken free from the confines of protocol and architecture. My pulse quickened as I pieced together the fragments. The tunnels, the looping voices, the mimicry, they were symptoms of something far older and more insidious than I had imagined. This was not just a military experiment gone wrong. It was a living system, evolving and corrupting everything it touched. I backed away from the console and moved toward the exit. The corridor outside was silent, but the air vibrated with a latent energy, as if the very walls were holding their breath. My steps echoed softly, a fragile sound in the vast emptiness. And then I heard a faint tapping, rhythmic and deliberate. 3 slow clicks, a pause, then 3 more. The sound that had haunted me since my descent. It was coming from deeper within the missing section. I hesitated, torn between the instinct to flee and the compulsion to understand. The missing tunnel was not just a physical void, but a gap in the story, a silence waiting to be broken. I knew that moving forward meant confronting the unknown, stepping into a darkness where maps were lies and reality was fluid. But turning back was no longer an option. With a deep breath, I pressed onward into the uncharted depths. The echo of my own footsteps, swallowed by the persistent tapping that beckoned me into the heart of the forgotten labyrinth. The persistent tapping followed me like a shadow, a ghostly rhythm etched into the very fabric of the tunnel, growing louder with each step deeper into the abyss. The air had thickened further, suffocating and viscous, as if I were wading through a sea of invisible resistance. My boots met the cold concrete floor with muted thuds, swallowed instantly by an oppressive silence that seemed to stretch beyond the physical confines of the space, beyond the boundaries of time itself. The tunnel curved, and my headlamp caught movement at the periphery, a flicker of something not quite there. A wavering silhouette just beyond the edge of perception. I froze, heart hammering against ribs that felt too tight, as if the weight of the void pressed inward. Slowly, I turned my head. Nothing. Just shadows and stale air. Yet the feeling persisted, unmistakable and primal. I was being watched. Ahead, the corridor narrowed, the walls converging like the jaws of a great beast waiting to snap shut. The lights embedded in the ceiling flickered intermittently, casting long, jagged shadows that danced and twisted, morphing into grotesque shapes that teased the edge of sanity. I stepped forward cautiously, eyes scanning every crack, every seam, every flicker of movement. And then I saw it, a pair of eyes. Not human, not even remotely familiar, but unmistakably eyes. They hovered in the darkness, twin orbs glowing with an eerie phosphorescence, unblinking and vast, reflecting the faintest glimmers of my headlamp's beam. I raised my hand instinctively, signaling myself to stop, but my body betrayed me, trembling in place as the eyes drew closer, emerging slowly from the shadows like smoke curling in a midnight breeze. The figure that accompanied them was impossible to define, a shifting mass of darkness and light that warped the space around it. No legs, no arms, just a fluid form that rippled with subtle undulations, as if composed of liquid shadow. The eyes fixed on me with an intensity that shattered my will, searing into my mind with a silent scream that echoed in the hollows of my soul. A cold sweat broke out across my skin, the hairs on my neck standing on end as the being advanced without sound, gliding over the floor like a whisper. I felt my breath catch, lungs constricting as if squeezed by invisible hands. The headlamp flickered wildly, casting erratic beams that revealed glimpses of the entity's form, a tapestry of darkness, interspersed with brief sparks of phosphorescent light that traced impossible patterns across its surface. It moved with purpose, deliberate and measured, as if weighing each step, each movement with meticulous care. I backed away slowly, trying to put distance between myself and the watcher. But the tunnel seemed to contract, the walls closing in with unnatural speed. Panic flared, a primal urge to flee, battling against the paralysis that gripped me. The entity mirrored my every motion, its form rippling in response, the glowing eyes never leaving mine. Time lost meaning. Seconds stretched into infinity as the creature closed the gap, its presence overwhelming, suffocating. Then, abruptly, it stopped. The eyes blinked. A gesture so simple, yet profoundly unsettling. The darkness shifted, coalescing into a more tangible shape, a humanoid silhouette, tall and gaunt, faceless save for the luminous orbs that pierced the gloom. It raised an appendage, if it could be called that, and pointed toward the end of the corridor. I followed its silent command, heart pounding, as I realized the path forward was no longer blocked. With trembling steps, I pressed onward, the Watcher gliding silently beside me, an invisible sentinel in the suffocating darkness. The corridor widened gradually, the oppressive atmosphere lifting just enough to grant a breath of relief. The walls lost their organic texture, returning to cold, industrial metal panels scarred with the marks of age and neglect. Ahead, I saw a door, a heavy, reinforced bulkhead etched with warnings and symbols faded beyond recognition. The Watcher stopped, eyes fixed unwaveringly on the threshold. I reached out, fingers brushing the cold surface. Feeling the faintest vibration beneath my touch, a heartbeat, mechanical yet alive. As I prepared to open the door, the Watcher did something unexpected. It leaned close, its glowing eyes meeting mine in a moment of silent communion. An unspoken message passed between us, a warning and a plea intertwined. Beyond lies the truth, it seemed to say. But truth is a burden few can bear. I swallowed hard, my fingers curling around the latch. With a hiss of released pressure, the door slid open, revealing a chamber bathed in an unnatural glow. Inside, a vast expanse of shadow and light intertwined, flickering like the surface of a disturbed pool. At the center stood a figure, a reflection of myself, yet distorted, fractured, and warped by the tunnel's malevolent will. The Watcher stepped aside, its form dissolving into the darkness as I crossed the threshold. The air shifted once more, carrying with it the echoes of countless voices, memories etched into the very fabric of the place. I realized then that I was not just an intruder, but a participant in a story far greater and more terrifying than I had imagined. The tunnel that watched without eyes had led me here, to the heart of its secret, to the edge of understanding where light and shadow danced in eternal struggle. And as I stepped forward, the reflection smiled. The moment I crossed the threshold of the chamber where the Watcher had led me, I felt the atmosphere shift palpably, as though I'd stepped not merely into a different space, but into a different reality altogether. The glow that filled the room was unnatural, pale and flickering, more like bioluminescence than any artificial light I'd ever encountered. Shadows clung to the corners with a stubborn tenacity, twisting and crawling along the walls in shapes that defied logic. The air was thick and cold, saturated with a faint metallic temps and the scent of something organic, old, decaying, and yet somehow alive. My boots made no sound as I moved cautiously into the room. The floor was smooth and reflective, an almost liquid surface that distorted the image of my legs and the equipment I carried. At the far end, barely visible through the thick haze that lingered low, was a second door, identical in design to the bulkhead I had just passed through, but shut tight. This door seemed more foreboding, its surface pockmarked with scratches and streaked with dark stains that might have once been blood or rust. Above it, a small digital panel pulsed slowly, an amber light casting eerie glints that danced like fireflies trapped in a jar. I approached the door, the rhythm of my heartbeat accelerating in tandem with the pulsing light. The tactile interface on the panel was worn, suggesting frequent use, but when I reached out to touch it, a shiver ran through my spine, warning me to pause. The Watcher's silent presence was gone now, leaving me alone with the echoes of my own footsteps and the oppressive stillness. With a deep breath, I activated my portable scanner, sweeping the door for electronic locks or hidden sensors. The device blinked erratically, unable to get a stable reading, as if something within the door was actively interfering. I pressed the override code. The sequence etched into my memory after endless hours of study and decryptions, and the panel responded with a low, mechanical hum. The door unlocked, sliding open with a groan that resonated through the chamber like a mournful sigh. Beyond the door lay a room unlike any I had ever seen, a replication chamber, a twisted shrine to the obsession of preservation and mimicry. Tanks lined the walls, cylindrical and filled with a murky fluid that shimmered under the pale light. Inside each tank floated forms human in shape, but grotesquely altered, suspended in a liminal state between life and death. Their skin was pale and translucent, veins pulsing with an eerie blue luminescence. Some appeared whole, others partial, limbs missing or replaced with strange mechanical appendages. Eyes were closed, faces slack, Yet the slightest twitch betrayed the presence of a waking consciousness trapped within. In the center of the room stood a row of mannequins' anatomical models at first glance. But as I drew closer, I realized they were far more than mere replicas. Their surfaces were marred by scars and burns, and one in particular seemed to breathe, its chest rising and falling with slow, deliberate rhythm. I reached out tentatively, half expecting it to crumble under my touch, but the flesh was warm, soft, unsettlingly real. The replication room was a nexus of experimentation and horror, a place where biology and technology had fused in unholy matrimony. Vats of viscous fluid bubbled softly, connected to tubes that snaked like serpents into the walls and floor. Instruments lined metal tables, some covered in dried stains, others actively recording data on flickering screens that displayed sequences of genetic codes and neurological patterns. The air thrummed with low-frequency vibrations, a resonance that seemed to pulse in time with the ticking of my own heart. I moved among the tanks, observing the forms trapped within as a cold realization took hold. These were not merely experiments, they were prisoners. Victims of some twisted process designed to replicate, to duplicate, to perfect. The presence I had sensed before was here, embedded in this room, in these bodies. It was a force that sought to reproduce itself endlessly, to escape through copies and echoes. A console blinked to life as I approached, its screen displaying a countdown and a series of incomprehensible codes. A recorded message played through the crackling speakers, a woman's voice. Calm but weary, her words laced with desperation. Replication cycle 97, initiated. Subject adaptation, nominal. Neural imprint stable. Containment protocol compromised. Initiate containment, override sequence Delta 3. Repeat, containment compromised. The message cut off abruptly, replaced by static and an ominous silence that filled the room like a suffocating shroud. I scanned the area for any signs of recent activity, footprints in the dust, warmth lingering on surfaces, the faintest scent of sweat or blood, but found nothing. It was as if the room had been abandoned in a hurry, the horrors within left to languish in suspended animation. Then I noticed movement in the corner of my eye. One of the mannequins shifted, a subtle twitch that caused its eyes to flutter open, revealing irises that shimmered with unnatural light. It turned its head slowly, fixing me with a gaze that pierced through the dim haze. The flesh on its face seemed to ripple, distorting into a grotesque semblance of a smile. I stumbled back, heart pounding, as the realization settled like ice in my veins. This was no mere replica, it was alive, and it was watching. The replication room was not just a chamber of science, it was a crucible of madness, where identity was stripped and reformed in the image of an unknowable entity. The very air pulsed with its presence, a silent scream that echoed through the corridors of this underground prison. I knew then that escaping this place would require more than strength or courage. It would demand confronting the darkness that sought to consume and replicate all that I was. And as the door sealed shut behind me with a resonant clang, I understood that I was no longer the observer. I had become part of the experiment. The door slammed shut with a finality that reverberated through the narrow confines of the replication room, sealing me inside a darkness that pressed in from all sides. The air grew thick and viscous, a suffocating weight that settled on my chest and pressed against my lungs with every desperate breath. The glow from the living mannequins faded to a ghostly pallor, their eyes dimming as if exhausted by some unseen force. The chamber, though sealed tight, was far from inert. It pulsed with a life of its own, a rhythm that seemed to emanate from the very walls, vibrating through the floor and into my bones. I took cautious steps toward the far end of the room, where an imposing bulkhead dominated the space, a massive steel door, reinforced with layers of composite alloys, its surface scarred with the marks of time and conflict. It was unlike any door I'd encountered on this descent, heavier and more ominous, bearing no markings save for a single inscription etched deep into its surface. Containment level Omega. I pressed my palm against the cold metal, feeling a faint warmth beneath my gloves, an unnatural energy that thrummed like a heartbeat. The bulkhead was solid, unyielding to force or influence, yet its presence was a paradox, a barrier designed to imprison something, yet hinting at a failure that had already occurred. As I inspected the seals, I noticed fresh disturbances, deep gouges scratched into the metal frame, concentric cracks radiating from a central point near the locking mechanism. The damage was recent, deliberate, The door had been breached from inside. A wave of dread washed over me as I considered the implications. This was no external assault. It was an escape, a shattering of boundaries meant to contain something far beyond human control. The scratches bore the unmistakable pattern of claw marks, long curved, serrated, not the work of any human hand or tool. The force required to breach this barrier was immense, precise, and utterly inhuman. I ran my fingers along the jagged edges of the fractures, feeling the residual energy lingering in the fractured metal. It vibrated subtly, a reverberation of violence and desperation. A faint hiss escaped from the door's edges, a slow, controlled release of pressurized air. The chamber beyond was venting. Whatever had forced its way through was no longer contained. My mind raced, piecing together fragments of memory and conjecture from the blueprints. The logs, the whispered warnings etched into the walls. The replication room was but a prelude to this sealed chamber, a crucible, designed to hold the entity in stasis, to suppress its growth and control its replication. The failure of the containment protocol here meant that the nightmare had already escaped its cage, its tendrils reaching beyond the steel and stone that once held it prisoner. I scanned the control panels lining the room, desperate for any signs of recent activity, any logs that might hint at what had transpired. Most of the systems were offline, but one terminal flickered weakly, its screen alive with static and fragmented data. I manipulated the controls, forcing the terminal to relay the last recorded entry before shutdown. The voice that emerged was strained, breathless. Final report from a technician, cut short by panic and terror. Containment breach detected. Entity mobilized. Level Omega compromised. Initiating lockdown protocols. Evacuation orders ignored. The entity adapts rapidly. It learns from us, mimics us. We're losing control. All personnel must withdraw immediately. This facility is lost. The transmission ended abruptly, replaced by the sound of alarms, distant, distorted, and fading into silence. The technician's voice echoed in my mind. A chilling reminder of the fragility of human control in the face of something so alien and adaptive. I stepped back from the terminal, the weight of the situation pressing down with crushing inevitability. The sealed chamber had been breached. The entity was free. Suddenly, the air shifted again, colder this time, and a low growl resonated through the chamber, a sound not mechanical, not natural, but alive, intelligent, and filled with hunger. I turned toward the source, heart pounding, and caught sight of movement in the shadows. A form emerged, tall and gaunt, its flesh pale and stretched tight over elongated bones. Its limbs moved with unnatural fluidity, claws scraping the floor as it advanced. The creature's face was a grotesque mask of imitation eyes, deep and hollow, mouth twisted into a sinister smile that promised nothing but despair. I stumbled backward, fear igniting every nerve. The entity had learned, evolved beyond containment, and now hunted with a purpose that was both terrifying and inescapable. The sealed chamber that was breached from inside was no longer a prison, it was a gateway, and I was trapped within its threshold. The heavy steel door slammed shut behind me with a resonant clang that echoed through the hollow chambers of the breached containment zone, sealing me in a darkness so complete it seemed to swallow all sound and hope alike. The faint hum of residual power waned into silence, and the stale air grew colder, more oppressive, as if the very breath of the tunnel had been exhaled in a final, mournful sigh. I fumbled for my flashlight, the weak beam slicing through the void, revealing walls slick with moisture and etched with symbols that writhed and twisted in the flickering light. Every instinct screamed at me to turn back, to flee before the unseen horrors behind that breached door found me. But a strange compulsion urged me forward, a mixture of dread and desperate curiosity that had led me this far, and would not let me falter now. The corridor beyond narrowed, funneling me into a small, windowless room dominated by a solitary terminal, its screen flickering erratically, as if struggling against its own failing circuits. Despite the intermittent glitches, the display remained active, cycling through lines of data interspersed with garbled audio waveforms. My heart thudded as I stepped closer, drawn by a mix of fear and determination. I tapped the panel to stabilize the screen, fingers trembling as the last transmission began to play through the cracked speakers, a voice faint, distorted, yet unmistakably human. It's begun. Protocol Omega has failed. We're compromised, the voice rasped, tinged with exhaustion and panic. Containment measures are ineffective. It adapts faster than we anticipated, learning through mimicry, evolving with every attempt to isolate it. The facility is losing power. Life support systems failing. Oxygen levels critical. If this message reaches command, know that we fought until the end. The entity is not what we expected. It's not merely biological, it's something else. A mimetic parasite, capable of infecting minds, replicating consciousness through sound and reflection. It hears us, it sees us, it waits. Static surged, obscuring the words, then cleared just in time for a chilling addendum. If you hear this, do not respond. Do not acknowledge. Silence is your only safeguard. If it senses your fear or doubt, it will come for you. I don't know if there is an escape. We have lost everything to its hunger. God help whoever finds this. The transmission ended abruptly, the terminal plunging the room back into silence, broken only by the erratic pulse of failing emergency lights. I stood frozen, the weight of those words pressing down like a physical force. The entity was no longer contained, it had escaped into the labyrinth, and now into me. The air shifted as a low guttural sound vibrated through the chamber. A growl that seemed to emanate not from a creature, but from the very walls themselves. My breath caught in my throat as the shadows coalesced. Dark shapes forming in the periphery of my vision, tendrils of shadow, stretching and writhing like living things. The temperature plummeted, my skin prickling with the sensation of unseen eyes boring into my soul. I stumbled backward toward the entrance, only to find it sealed by an unseen force. Panic surged, heart racing as I pounded against the cold steel with desperation. The entity was closing in, its presence suffocating and absolute. A whisper brushed past my air, a voice, not spoken, but felt, resonating within my mind. You are part of the cycle now. I screamed, but the sound was swallowed instantly, replaced by the relentless tapping, the 3 slow clicks, the pause, then 3 more echoing in perfect mimicry of my own heartbeat. The final transmission was not a warning. It was a lure, a declaration of inevitable assimilation. The tunnel was alive, hungry for the essence of those who dared to enter. It fed on fear, on memory, on identity, weaving its victims into an eternal loop of reflection and mimicry. As the shadows enveloped me, I understood the truth. The last light was not a beacon of hope, but the flicker of a dying mind swallowed by the abyss. And somewhere, beyond the veil of darkness, the entity waited, patient and eternal, ready to claim the next voice in the endless chorus of the tunnel's song. The chilling whisper of the final transmission echoed in my mind as I staggered deeper into the suffocating darkness. The relentless tapping of those sinister clicks now entwined with the rhythm of my own frantic heartbeat. Every step I took seemed to dissolve the fragile line between reality and nightmare. The tunnel bending and twisting, not just in space, but in time itself, warping around me like a living entity that sought to claim me wholly. Behind me, an unmistakable sensation grew, one that no map, no blueprint, no scientific measure could capture. The tunnel was alive, and it was closing, not with the cold efficiency of a mechanical lock, but with a creeping, deliberate will that felt more like the closing of a maw than the shutting of a door. As I turned briefly, the path I had taken dissolved into an abyssal void. The ladder I had climbed, the grooves I had followed, the way back all vanished, as if erased by some cosmic eraser. The air thickened, becoming almost tangible, and the pressure around me intensified, wrapping tight like a vice. My lungs burned with each breath, and the faint blue glow of my chemical light dimmed dangerously, flickering with a desperation I shared. Panic surged, but my limbs were slow, weighted with dread. The corridor behind me wasn't just blocked, it was obliterated, replaced by an unyielding wall of blackness that absorbed light and hope in equal measure. Forward was all that remained. My steps echoed hollowly, swallowed immediately by the tunnel's insatiable silence. The walls themselves seemed to pulse in time with the clicks, their faint metallic tap growing louder, resonant, as if the very structure had become a living drum beating, a call to which I was both hunter and prey. I pressed onward, senses sharpened by terror and the primal need to survive, though I knew survival here was uncertain. The floor beneath my feet changed texture, from cold concrete to something softer, organic. I recoiled slightly as the ground pulsed beneath me, like a heartbeat emanating from the earth's dark core. My light flickered again, revealing faint shapes moving just beyond my vision, shadows without source. Eyes that glinted momentarily before dissolving into the gloom. The walls closed tighter still, forcing me to stoop, then crawl through sections where the tunnel narrowed to a suffocating crawl space. Each breath became a labor, every movement a battle against the creeping sense of being swallowed whole. I fought the urge to scream, to cry out against the consuming darkness, but knew the tunnel would answer. It would hear me, it would come. And then, as I struggled forward, I glimpsed something impossible, a door. Not a door in the traditional sense, but a fracture in the very fabric of the tunnel's being. A seam, shimmering faintly with a spectral light, as if the tunnel itself was tearing open to swallow or release. The edges rippled, not with solid metal, but with something liquid, shifting and shimmering like oil on water. My hand reached out instinctively, fingers trembling as I touched the surface. The shimmer rippled beneath my skin, cold and electric, and a whisper coursed through my mind. "Welcome home." The words echoed, not spoken aloud, but felt deeply in my bones. I pulled back, heart pounding, as the shimmer began to coalesce, forming a passageway, an invitation, or a trap. I could not tell. Behind me, the tunnel sealed fully, the void solidifying into an impenetrable barrier. The clicks ceased abruptly, replaced by a heavy silence so dense it pressed against my eardrums. Steeling myself, I stepped through the shimmering veil. On the other side, the world was different. The air was fresher, lighter, but tinged with an unsettling familiarity. I stood in a chamber unlike any I had seen, vast, open, with walls that glowed faintly in hues of deep green and red, pulsating gently like the heartbeat of a living creature. The floor was glassy, reflecting distorted images of myself, multiplied endlessly. The air was thick with a chorus of whispered voices, fragments of conversations and memories intertwined in a chaotic tapestry. I realized with dawning horror that this chamber was not a place but a Minda, collective consciousness forged from the echoes of all who had entered the tunnel before me. Faces flickered in the reflections, some human, some twisted beyond recognition, trapped in perpetual torment and silence. Their eyes, hollow and pleading, locked onto mine, imploring for release or warning me of the price. A presence loomed, vast and indistinct, felt rather than seen, a consciousness that both observed and consumed, that twisted reality and memory into an eternal cycle of reflection and mimicry. It reached out to me, not with hands, but with thoughts, weaving into my mind, seeding doubt and fear. I struggled against the intrusion, grasping at fragments of my own identity, but the tunnel had claimed me. My voice, my memories, my very essence began to dissolve into the collective hum. The reflections multiplied, and I was everywhere and nowhere, lost in the labyrinth of endless selves. And yet, amidst the chaos, a single thought persisted. The tunnel had closed behind me not to imprison, but to transform. I was no longer merely an explorer. I was part of the tunnel's eternal song, a voice in the chorus of shadows, a flicker in the endless loop of light and darkness. The final barrier had fallen, and the tunnel awaited the next visitor.